Over the years, we have seen quite a few fighters no one expects to get the job done in a championship setting end up shocking the world. And while underdog stories are cool and all, in this tier list, I want to talk about the opposite. All of the fighters that were supposed to get the job done, the hype trains, guys who in hindsight had no business being in there with the champion, but before the fight were either the favorite or barely considered a betting underdog. So that's what we're going to do in this tier list. We are going to be ranking overrated title contenders. Now, obviously, this is all just my opinion, but I have a bit of criteria I'm working with just so you can see how I've made my decisions. As usual, though, if you disagree with any of the fighters I have picked or think I've missed any, please let me know down in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and all that good shit. Okay, let's get to the criteria. So, the criteria I'm going off of is in a way vibes based, okay, but not entirely subjective. So, number one, what was the sentiment from the fan base? If you are someone who spends a lot of time in online MMA spaces, I have a feeling you will probably agree with most of these, but at least some of them. Also, what were the betting odds? Guys who were either way too close or too small of an underdog, and in more severe cases, as we move up the tier list, fighters that were favorites in what ended up being their opponent's easiest fight, and if applicable, whatever push the fighters were receiving from the UFC's marketing machine. Fighters the UFC very clearly wanted to be successful and maybe put them in a position that they shouldn't have been in. Something I call the Conor McGregor effect, by the way. They are so blinded by trying to get another star that is even remotely close to as big as Conor McGregor that they end up doing things that hurt these fighters, at least in the short term. But either way, dude, let's get to the tier list. Okay, now we're going to start with D tier. The first fighter to get put into that D tier slot is going to be Jorge Gamebred Masvidal in his first fight against Kamaru Usman. Now, Jorge Masvidal was able to capture the eyes of a massive part of the fan base with just a couple of moments, couple of viral moments, and has been running with it ever since. I'll give him credit, however, right? At least he was able to capitalize on it and monetize on it, even still to this day.
Fighting to this day, to this day, to this day.
And again, looking back, it's much easier to critique the minds of so many people with the information that we have available to us now, but he was absolutely overrated, and in my opinion, still is. I'll see fans excited about him talking about a return fight when I don't think anything could make me less excited at this point in time. Even Dana White doesn't really want anything to do with that.
Jorge Masvidal, Tyron Woodley's names keep coming up, YouTube interviews, social media. Any chance they end up back in the octagon, or probably not?
Probably not.
Now, going into his first fight with Kamaru Usman, I think it was on 6 or 7 days notice, whatever, right? Which should have been a point against him, but it wasn't really. It was actually used to bolster the argument that he could just come in and, you know, just wipe out Kamaru Usman because it's just destiny lining up or whatever the fuck people say, you know. And it was a large part of the marketing for that event was him cutting 21 pounds in just 7 days. So a rough weight cut, short notice against a guy in Kamaru Usman who at the time was on an 11-fight win streak in the UFC, had just dethroned Tyron Woodley, who was a fairly long-reigning champion, and also beat Colby Covington in one of the most anticipated fights in welterweight history. Masvidal was 3-2 in his last 5, okay? And one thing that annoys me, and it annoyed me at the time, it still annoys me now, it is so fucking annoying and cringe, okay, is that stupid fucking jungle story that Joe Rogan kept pushing, right?
He was on this reality show, and Dan Lambert said it was terrible experience. He's by himself all day, no phone. He had to go into the village to get food. There's no fucking food. Like,
where was the island?
I forget. Somewhere in South America.
Okay.
But the experience was several months, and it was a disaster. And he didn't like it at all. And then it forced him to think about where he's at, where he could be. And one of the things he was saying is like all these split decisions, and he was thinking like, why did it go that way instead of the other way? Like, why did I lose that fight instead of win it? Because there was a lot of them that are really close.
Yeah.
And he was thinking, well, maybe I could just have done a little bit more and won that fight. And then he said, why am I thinking like a fucking peasant? He goes, why didn't I just knock that motherfucker out? And so that shift in his mentality changed. And then all of a sudden he murks Donald Cerrone, murks Darren Till, murks Ben Askren, beats the fuck out of Nate Diaz. Like, he's a different person now. And now he's what he could have been.
Like, his current win streak was low enough that Joe Rogan had to literally lie and add Donald Cowboy Cerrone to the list of guys that he had beaten since coming back from the jungle, even though that was years before his return. That was, you know, one of the fights before he left to this alleged jungle journey. Okay, like, you know, Jorge Masvidal, actually thinking about it, kind of looks like Mowgli, just with a beard. But either way, I mean, he was on a reality TV show, for fuck's sakes, dude. They were acting like he went full nomad in like deep Russia or some shit. But despite all that, he was still a pretty small underdog going into this fight, about plus 200-ish range. And for context, right, that might not seem very small of an underdog right now to us talking about it, but Colby Covington was like a plus 160 or plus 170 going into his fight with Kamaru Usman, the first one, which is crazy considering the accomplishments of the two guys at the time if you compare them, right? I know Colby's cringe and hasn't really done anything as of late, but at the time, Jorge Masvidal beat Darren fucking Till, okay, Ben Askren, and Nate Diaz. But regardless, casuals found it. He just, you know, casuals just thought he could.
This fight, can't blame him. Go do your thing. But Usman's gonna get baptized, man.
Fucking baptize everybody, which was what is so cringe. But either way, dude, moving on to the next overrated title contender to get put into that D tier spot, and that is going to be Paulo Costa for his fight, or going into his fight with Israel Adesanya. Now, Paulo Costa against Israel Adesanya was only a plus 155 underdog, and the way that fight went, you'd think he was like a plus 500, or at least that's what it looked like, okay? Paulo Costa had beaten no real top flight competition aside from Yoel Romero, which, by the way, was a very controversial decision, okay? There are still people arguing in my best boxer in the UFC tier list video about that decision somehow, some way, even though it had nothing to do with the fucking video, okay? The comment thread is like 50 replies long. It's crazy. Either way. But so much so, it was so controversial, especially at the time, that Yoel ended up getting a title shot before Paulo Costa did, okay? Crazy, right? We've only, off the top of my head, I can think of Jose Aldo against Marlon Moraes and that being the case there, but I can't think of many other where a fight was so decided on by the fans or by Dana White that he was willing to give a title shot to the loser, okay? Crazy. Either way, the list of guys that Israel Adesanya had beaten compared to Paulo Costa was crazy, right? On the side of Paulo Costa, we're talking about Johnny Hendricks, okay? And fucking Uriah Hall. Crazy. But when you look on the side of Israel Adesanya, we've got Whitaker, Gastelum, Brunson, Silva, and then, of course, one of the worst fights ever against Yoel Romero. I feel like part of this was maybe their fights with Yoel Romero when you compare the two, right? Israel looked kind of scared to engage, stayed at range, leg kick to a somewhat controversial decision, whereas Paulo Costa was going almost tit for tat with Romero the entire 3 rounds. So even if you think to yourself, oh, well, they both had kind of close controversial decisions with Yoel Romero, one guy clearly did way more damage in the fight than the other. Also, the aesthetics of the two, probably Paulo Costa, this big shredded fucking Brazilian, looks like he hits real hard, but in reality just throws meaty hooks, okay? Shout out to Lucas Tracy or whatever. The narrative about Israel Adesanya was still just a skinny, lanky guy who would utilize his range and kind of just pick you apart on his way to the title. He did, however, have a mix of TKOs and decisions, right? He oftentimes gets remembered for his boring fights, which is fine. You know, I'm not necessarily a fan of Israel Adesanya either, but he did have a decent mix on the way up, right? His fight with Anderson Silva was, you know, not very good except for the first round. It was more just, I guess, nostalgia seeing Anderson in there with a guy that was somewhat similar in the sense that they're both tall and dark and lank. I don't fucking know. Either way, the Tavares fight was pretty good. Like, it was a good performance. He wasn't able to get the finish. And of course, the Gastelum fight was fantastic. But, you know, he also knocked out Derek Brunson, Robert Whitaker, and whatever along the way as well. So I will say this, though. A lot of people at the time kind of attributed him knocking out Rob the way that he did to a few things. Both, you know, the way Rob decided to lunge in for some reason, and also the fact that he had gone 10 hard rounds with Yoel Romero right before fighting Israel Adesanya, essentially, and had a whole host of health issues and all the rest of it. But either way. So people were kind of expecting Paulo Costa to cause problems for Israel Adesanya, right? This big, strong, shredded Brazilian whose shots look a lot more damaging than I think they actually are. Constantly going forward, willing to exchange, and had a good chin. At least that's what people thought going into the fight, right? After that Yoel Romero fight. Then we got Paulo Costa getting his legs brutalized, which he had cupping marks all over them to boot, like a legit target. you know. Then he got head kicked, cut open, dropped eventually, and completely and totally fucking violated.
Here to talk about the action that human trash did. The human trash did after a fight. I didn't see when I was there on the cage, but I saw now. I disapprove 100%.
Okay, either way, dude, let's move on to the next overrated title contender to go into that D tier spot, and that is going to be Cyril Gane. Now, he wasn't fighting the current champion in Jon Jones. This was a vacant title fight, but still, dude, okay? Cyril Gane was a plus 150, barely an underdog, and got finished in 2 fucking minutes. Landed like 6 strikes, okay? This guy had so much hype, and I mean, he is a very marketable individual, and I do think the UFC was giving him a bit of a push, although not necessarily more than they were pushing Jon Jones at the time, and to be fair, still are. But I mean, even in his home, like his, you know, in France or whatever the fuck, he's getting put on GQ magazine and things like this, so he was a pretty, you know, marketable dude. Fast forward to today, the guy's been ducking fights with Tom Aspinall. He's inactive and entitled. And I'm not talking about Jon Jones. I am talking about Cyril Gane. A lot of people forget, man. People forget, man. In his interview with Ariel Helwani, after he beat Sergey Spivak, he was calling for another title shot, even though he had just had 2 back-to-back and got finished in 2 minutes, okay? But going into this fight, a lot of people, to be fair, thought he would beat Jon. And there were some legitimate reasons to think so. Jon had basically just lost to Dominic Reyes in his last fight, which was also years before his fight with Cyril Gane. So, you know, maybe he didn't lose officially, but in the eyes of, I believe, the vast majority of the fan base, he definitely lost. And that was a light heavyweight with much worse striking than Cyril Gane. And also, there's now this size difference that we have to consider. And it had been a while since we got to look at what Jon Jones, you know, what he was doing and shit, because he was inactive for so long. And I think a lot of people didn't necessarily know what to expect, because a large part of him not moving up to heavyweight until the time that he did towards the end of his career was, I feel like he was kind of scared to in his earlier days and didn't want to risk getting knocked out when he was having so much success at the weight class below. But either way, okay? The fight starts. Cyril Gane looks like a fool, if I'm being honest. Lands a low blow, and a few kicks later extends heavily on a left hand, which was maybe like the one fucking thing he couldn't do. And he just did it. To Jon's credit, takes full advantage of it. Drags the guy to the ground like the guy's never wrestled in his fucking life. And 2 minutes into the first round, we get a tap. You know, I feel like he lost so much hype and credibility after this fight that even though he came back and defeated Sergey Spivak pretty impressively, rarely do we hear people bring up Cyril Gane's name when we're talking about who could be in contention for a heavyweight title. Now, maybe he changes that in his fight versus Volkov, but still, it's crazy. Now, not just the odds, right? Plus 150, he's still an underdog, which is pretty crazy considering Jon Jones, you know, had taken so much time off. But Jon Jones was used to seeing like minus 450, minus 500 on his side. So that tells me that a lot of people were actually thinking Cyril Gane might be able to get the job done. Either way, dude, let us move on now to C tier. The first overrated title contender to get put into that C tier spot is gonna be Yuri Prochazka for his rematch against Alex Pereira. And almost, to me at least anyways, this one might be a little bit more controversial, but in the first fight as well. But I'll focus on the second one mainly. So Yuri Prochazka, after getting finished in the first fight, was only a plus 120 underdog against Alex Pereira, and he got absolutely fucking dog walked, okay? He was a smaller underdog in the first fight, of course. I think it was minus 105. So it was essentially a pick'em fight. Now, Yuri fans get really triggered unless you just compliment him relentlessly, right? Talk about how he's a samurai warrior and all the fucking rest of it. But at least in this sense, for these fights, he was, in my opinion, overrated. I get that the unpredictability or whatever of Yuri, along with his power, could potentially create problems for almost everybody, but if you took an objective look at both of these guys' striking patterns, if you watched Alex Pereira's sparring footage in the lead-up, and just even in past fights, you should have known that Yuri Prochazka was probably going to get clipped at some point. Yuri Prochazka, while he sometimes grapples, is for the most part a striker, you know, so I don't think it should have been expected that he was going to go out there and try to wrestle Alex Pereira for the full 25 minutes. But either way, get clipped he did, right? Yuri fans had a saving grace in the first fight. Of course, the stoppage was a little premature. So going into the rematch with just a win over Alexander Rakic, which by the way was a comeback win in a fight where Yuri showed us that he has all of the same defensive holes that led me to pick Alex Pereira in the first fight, right? Somehow the odds were super close. Again, you get finished against this guy, right? Maybe 6 months prior or whatever it was. And then you get one win that we saw you were eating calf kicks and all the rest of it. And then you come back to fight the guy that fucked you up the first time, and the odds barely move. Like, that is insane to me, right? And not only that, the Rakic win was on the same card that Alex Pereira had maybe one of the best performances we'd seen up to that point against Jamal Hill. So when you take in all of that context, the fact that the odds moved so minorly is insane, and I do think this is a symptom of Yuri Prochazka fans, dude. They are unhinged, okay? And of course, we got one, if not the best performance we have seen out of Alex Pereira thus far. Completely flawless, in my opinion. Multiple traps laid, all successful. Finished it off with a switch kick to the head and ground and pound that was so convincing that not even Yuri Prochazka fans could cope about a premature stoppage. I will say this, however, right? MMA is weird, to be fair. A plus 120 underdog after he gets finished in the first fight gets slept brutally after being completely dismantled on the feet. Meanwhile, the plus 400 or whatever it was that Khalil Roundtree was takes it to the fourth round in what was one of Alex Pereira's more tougher fights. So, you know, it's the way she goes sometimes. Okay, either way, dude, let's move on to the next overrated title contender to go into C tier, and that is going to be Jamal Hill for his fight with Alex Pereira as well. Okay, now I said this in my last video when I was or maybe not my last video, but when I was talking about the title performances of 2024, that a lot of people forget that these fights, while in hindsight when we're looking at Alex Pereira's title defenses, pardon me, seem like it was obvious. At the time, they weren't, to a lot of people at the very least. Jamal Hill was almost a pick'em. He was a plus 120, just like Yuri Prochazka was, against Alex Pereira. And in hindsight, that is criminal and fucking insane, in my opinion. And if you are a betting man, you would have been smart to put a ton of money on Alex Pereira, right? There were so many people that legitimately thought Jamal Hill would knock out Alex Pereira. I have no idea how the odds were this close, and thought as much at the time. Jamal Hill admitted he would not be grappling.
Boxer in the kickboxer realm, they tend not to get their ass knocked out like Yuri did, right? But from my perspective, what you're saying, you're telling me is that you're gonna go in there intelligently, you're gonna put him where he's the weakest at, and basically make it easy, make it look real easy. Do you think that's credited to your?
I'm not talking about even just. I'm talking about striking.
Oh, you're gonna knock him out?
Yeah, bro. I gotta shut him down at what he does the best and put him to sleep.
And much like Yuri Prochazka, if you look at some of Jamal Hill's striking defense, it should have been quite obvious that Alex Pereira would probably land that left hook at some point, which is of course exactly what happened. The same tendencies Jamal Hill has in all of his fights, but in front of a guy who is a top tier striker, very quickly became a problem. This was literally Alex's easiest fight yet, aside from maybe the fight with Sean Strickland, which is funny because some of the tendencies that we saw Sean Strickland have before he got knocked out by Alex Pereira is basically the same tendency that we saw from Jamal Hill. Sean Strickland, because he's got that Philly shell and his defense is very parry heavy, right? Now after that knockout, he's a lot more controlled with his parries. He doesn't swat all the way down with the rear hand the same way that he did against Alex Pereira, but that's what we saw from Jamal Hill as well. While he's in southpaw, so it's his lead hand, it is still the right hand coming down, full motion to swat away whatever it is Alex Pereira's offering, which is the body jab usually, right? So now Jamal Hill, I don't understand it, dude. Like I said, easiest fight yet aside from the Strickland fight, and there were massive chunks of the fan base that thought Jamal was gonna knock out Alex Pereira. Fucking crazy. There was even a time before this fight was actually made and shit where I thought Jamal Hill might end up giving Alex Pereira issues. Now before the fight, I cleared my head and realized, no, that's not going to be the case. But so many people did. And I think the odds show that. Right now, Jamal Hill hasn't gone, you know, on the insane losing streak that a guy like Marlon Moraes has or Tony Ferguson has. But so we are yet to see how much Alex Pereira truly broke this guy. You know, I was a Jamal Hill fan before this shit, right? It's sad. Okay, he's the only fighter to ever acknowledge me. Shouted out my channel in front of Eric Nixick and Paul Craig. Commented on multiple of my videos. Complimented me on my videos. Then because I tiptoe around his excuses being bullshit for this fight, his fucking producer comes into my chat on a live stream and is like trying to pick a fight with me over it. You know, it's insane. All right, either way, let's move on to the next fighter to get put into that C tier, which is gonna be Henry Cejudo coming back to fight Aljamain Sterling. Okay, he was a -120 favorite. Crazy. Henry Cejudo getting a completely unwarranted title shot, I'll add, coming back after 3 years of inactivity, surgeries, right? You could see the huge scar on his shoulder, becoming a parent as well, you know, so not necessarily training as much as he would, or at least potentially, somehow a favorite against Aljamain Sterling. Now, I can understand maybe some of the stylistic matchup arguments, and to be fair, it did end up being a pretty competitive fight, but it is kind of crazy considering, you know, the things that I said, 3 years of inactivity, also only defending his bantamweight title. The only defense he had at bantamweight was over a guy that was even more inactive than him, and Dominic Cruz, who had just been on the couch for like 4 fucking years, right? Crazy that he ended up coming in being the betting favorite. I'll also point out that, and this might be in, you know, it might be in large part due to Aljamain Sterling's title reign, not actually winning the title, in my opinion, losing the rematch and then beating an injured TJ Dillashaw, and maybe that's why the odds were what they were. But it was just crazy to me when you see the size discrepancy and you kind of look at how Henry Cejudo was able to avoid a lot of the tougher matchups at bantamweight because he got to fight Dominic Cruz and then fucked off right after that. So either way, dude, let's move on now to B tier. Okay, the first overrated title contender to get put into B tier is gonna be Marlon Moraes in his fight versus the aforementioned Henry Cejudo, okay, for the vacant bantamweight championship of the world. Now, Marlon Moraes was a -160, okay, in this fight against Henry. This one is truly like hindsight is 2020 type shit, okay? People don't, I feel like people don't realize, if you're a newer fan, the amount of hype that Marlon Moraes had was insane. He was so hyped up. One of the biggest hype trains of all time, and he got derailed by a guy that was moving up from flyweight. It was just crazy to see, you know. I understand Henry Cejudo is a legit combat athlete, but it's just funny to me that a guy that's like 5'3" or whatever Henry was the guy to derail Marlon Moraes, who was big by bantamweight's standards, right? Insane. And he was destroying guys on his way to this title fight. Head kicked Aljo stiff, head kicked Jimmy Rivera, subbed Rafael Assunção. Dude was on a legit tear through bantamweight, and even in the first round versus Cejudo, he looked fucking fantastic. It looked as though Henry was on his way to getting his ass beat when Cejudo, you know, I guess Henry Cejudo knew something many of us didn't, or I have no idea. Marlon Moraes cannot handle true adversity. Henry Cejudo at least exposed this for us. Marlon Moraes cannot handle true adversity, and apparently he can't adjust mid-fight, and also apparently has no fucking clue how to address a tie clinch. That was one of the craziest things I'd seen in my life. Cejudo made a massive adjustment, right? Just started going forward, making the fight ugly, and it worked. We saw Magic Marlon Moraes turn into a fucking muggle, okay? Real quick. All that magic just disappeared from his body. You could see it in the body language. You could hear it rather, in the verbal.
Your mother? What did your mother do to raise you? She scraped every dime, every day, and worked hard to get you to fight. You understand what I'm saying? Look at me. Think about what your mother did for you. Let's go, Marlon. You rocked in that last punch. Stop.
That he was expressing the way his coach, dude, in between rounds 2 and rounds 3, if I'm not mistaken, his coach, they were like panicking, bringing up his mother and everything they could do to try and pull the dog out of him, and it just didn't work. Now, Marlon Moraes went on to get knocked out, I think, 7 times in a row, or at least 7 times after this fight. Oh no, he did get knocked out 7 times in a row, or at least TKO'd / KO'd, but it was after one controversial split decision win over Jose Aldo, which I kind of brought up earlier, as an example of a guy getting a title shot coming off of a loss because Dana or the fans thought that he won, right? But Henry Cejudo truly broke this man, you know, truly broke him. Now, to be fair, at the time, it's not like he was overrated for no reason, right? His resume up until that point was impressive. His technique was impressive. He had good striking, good grappling, and a massive size advantage over a lot of guys at bantamweight, but more specifically Henry Cejudo. Crazy, dude. Now he's a fucking cop. Could you imagine if you did something, right, and you're even, I mean, listen, I understand he's more trained than like 90% of the population, but that doesn't fucking matter when you can't take a shot, okay? You as a criminal, and I'm not saying you should do this, okay? Just to make that clear, I'm not saying you should do this. I'm just pontificating on what could happen. If a criminal who knows about MMA sees that the officer who's arresting him is Marlon Moraes, if they just land a cheeky little left hook or something, that dude's out cold, and you can take off. You know, it would be like getting Phil Hawes arresting you. You'd be like, oh fuck, it's my lucky day. Okay, either way, dude, moving on to the next fighter to get put in that B tier, rather, the overrated title contender that was Ronda Rousey when she came back to fight Amanda Nunes. Okay, Rousey coming into this fight was a -175, almost a 2-to-1 favorite against Amanda Nunes, which is fucking wild in my opinion. She took her loss to Holly Holm horribly. I just said terribly and horribly in one word. I meant terribly, but it doesn't matter. Same shit. We didn't see anything from her or hear anything from her up until the fight. Like, she went radio silence. Like, just wouldn't talk to people. We didn't really get a whole lot of training footage or anything like that, right? 1 whole year later, massive holes in her striking were just exposed by Holly. Amanda, who's been active and getting finishes against everyone except for Valentina Shevchenko, who is obviously like one of the best women's fighters of all time. Now, obviously, the skill level of women's MMA is and will always be levels below the men's, okay? The skill and technique just will not be able to catch up. It's, you know, probably just a biological fact. But if we look at things relatively and compare it to the women's division from a few years ago when Ronda was dominating, when she came back for this fight, we had a girl in Amanda Nunes who, you know, had showed us over her last few fights at least that she could both strike and also had really good jiu-jitsu, and maybe the first time in the UFC at least a woman who had legitimate punching power, right? And then when you look at Ronda's loss to Holly and the fact that Amanda Nunes is, like I said, a skilled jiu-jitsu practitioner with the added power on the feet, the outcome of this fight was not all that shocking. But of course, if you ask Ronda, none of these losses are her fault or have anything to do with her. But after the fight, you know, I bet all the people that put money on Ronda to come get her belt back felt pretty fucking foolish, okay? Either way, dude. Moving on. I just don't understand, actually, not moving on. You see her get, like, her face fucking pieced up by Holly Holm. And then not just that, but head kicked. But before the head kick, she got hurt with the hands. And then you have a girl like Amanda Nunes who throws punches the way she does. And compare it to Holly Holm. Now, Holly Holm, I think, you know, we have a distorted view of Holly Holm nowadays because all she fucking does is cage push. Even if she's fighting a 2-time Olympian judoka or whatever, like, you know, horrible fight IQ, doesn't really strike. And also, we saw her get head kicked by Amanda. So her striking definitely dropped off. Probably, I would say, maybe after the Jermaine Durandamy fight or around then. But at the time, technically speaking, she might have been better than Amanda, but for sure she did not have the same level of power, right? Fucking, and then you see this chick who can crack and hurt girls, and you're like, okay, Ronda's gonna get it done for sure. Fucking crazy to me. Either way, now we will move on, okay? A tier. The first overrated title contender to go into that A tier slot is gonna be Francis Ngannou in his fight for Stipe Miocic. Obviously the first fight. Okay, Francis's fans get all up in arms if you want to talk negatively about him, pardon me. Even more so than Yuri Proska fans sometimes. But either way, dude, Francis Ngannou was almost a minus 200 favorite. I think it was like minus 170 or minus 175, similar to Ronda Rousey's. But the hype behind him was fucking crazy at this time. The time that the first fight was booked, right? The UFC machine was fully behind Francis Ngannou, which is crazy seeing the contrast. We compare how Dana White talks about Ngannou today and how he talked about him back then.
And Francis Ngannou has the world record for the most powerful punch. His punch is the equivalent to 96 horsepower, which is equal to getting hit by a Ford Escort going as fast as it can. And it's more powerful than a 12-pound sledgehammer swung full force from overhead. Francis isn't a good guy. He plays the good guy. I don't understand the language, and so he seems like he's a nice guy. He's not, and he's just not a guy that I wanted to be in business with.
Fucking night and day, right? We kept getting the whole hits harder than a Ford Escort at full speed, or some fucking dumb shit. Bro, I don't even understand how they measured that one. Also, he said something about a sledgehammer, full force, overhead swung. If you hit somebody in the head with a sledgehammer full force, they're dead. There's Francis Ngannou, maybe Alistair looked dead, but he kicked. He's not gonna kill someone. Seriously, how the fuck did they measure that? I just don't understand. Also, dude, a Ford Escort, like, pick a cooler fucking car, dude. Like, what, it's like a vehicle that moms, like, drive their kids to school in. It was strange, okay? But still, like the sledgehammer, that car at full speed, even if it is a Ford Escort or not, would kill you, So, I didn't really understand all that marketing, but either way, the UFC at the time was also having issues with Stipe Miocic, dude, in large part because of the very obvious lean the UFC had in this fight. This is why you see post-fight Stipe's coach wrapping the belt around his waist rather than Dana. Actually, Stipe goes up to Dana, takes the belt from him, and hands it to his coach so he can wrap him around the waist. Stipe Miocic felt very disrespected leading up to this fight because he could tell that the UFC had gotten behind Francis Ngannou and was fully on board. And he was upset at everybody, including Joe Rogan and guys like that were, calling Francis Ngannou, the most dangerous man on the planet and things like that. Either way. And look, I can kind of understand the overratedness or some shit of Francis Ngannou in this fight. But, it's just weird because up until that moment, Francis had a couple good names on his resume, but pretty much all guys that Stipe Miocic had already finished. So we got Andrei Arlovski and Alistair Overeem were the two big ones before he got the title shot. But if you look at Stipe's resume, he had already knocked out Arlovski. He had already knocked out Alistair. He also knocked out Fabricio Verdum and Junior Dos Santos and Mark Hunt. All of that before the Ngannou fight. Most of Francis's opponents, but before this, are basically unknown by the vast majority of the fans today. And in this fight, Stipe Miocic completely shut down Francis Ngannou, like completely, allowing him to land only 6 significant strikes after round 1. 21 significant strikes in the entire fight, and 15 came out of that first round. I mean, this fight was such a big bro moment, like Stipe literally lil bro'd him. I know Francis fans are going to bring up the second fight, and that's fine, you can do that, but just remember, that was 3 years later. Stipe showed Francis every hole that he had, and I know that sounded zesty as fuck, but you know what I mean, okay? So let's move on to the next overrated title contender to get put into A tier, and that is going to be Darren the Gorilla Till, okay? Fighting Tyron Woodley. Now, Darren Till was a minus 130 favorite against Tyron Woodley, which in hindsight was absolutely fucking insane. And Darren Till was severely overrated, just period. Not even just for this title fight. The ending of his time in the UFC was not great, right? Crazy. Okay. Darren Till in almost 2 full rounds landed exactly... in almost 2 full rounds. I don't know, it sounded weird the way I was saying that. But in almost 2 entire rounds, he landed 0 significant strikes, which I'm going to be honest, I didn't even realize that until I went back to watch this fight for this video. For some reason, I had just imagined that he landed at least a little bit, right? Not a single leg kick, no jabs, no fucking nothing. Nothing. Crazy. Looking all the way back to 2018, I don't even really understand the hype or the odds for this fight. His only good win at the time was against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, which was, you know, not a at the time it's a good win, but it was a pretty controversial decision, or at the very least it was very, very close. Largely uneventful aside from one knockdown, I think in round 4, maybe round 5, which was kind of similar to Tyron Woodley's fights with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, actually. But, you know, the two of them combined landed less than 70 significant strikes. I think it was like 38 to Till and 30 to Wonderboy. And it was a 5-round fight. Crazy. Now, I'm not going to shit on him necessarily for that, right? Like, Wonderboy's tricky to deal with. And at the time, he was a lot younger as well. Coming off of, like I mentioned, 2 really close fights with Tyron. But, you know, aside from that, he had a win over Cowboy, which, while it was impressive, it was Cowboy, who was, like, the end of Cowboy's career was, like, 2017. You know, he just kept going for some reason because he moved back down to lightweight, had a few good performances, and, you know, we got what we got. But, you know, he also used to be a lightweight. So Darren Till, a giant, who ended up going up to middleweight, got a TKO victory over an older Donald Cowboy Cerrone, who used to be a lightweight. Crazy. And also, at the time, was on a 2-fight skid leading up to that fight. You know, and if I told you the other guys Till had beat, most of you wouldn't have a fucking clue. He had a draw against Nicholas Dalby. That's the only name I could think of that I feel like the majority of somewhat hardcore MMA fans today would know, you know? So, but either way. Now, Tyron Woodley wasn't doing a good job whatsoever at marketing himself as a champion, or as a good champion, for that matter. We hadn't really seen a good performance since he won the title in 2016 against Robbie Lawler. We had the majority draw against Wonderboy, a majority decision against Wonderboy, which both of these fights were relatively uneventful. And then his title defense against Damian Maia was one of the worst title fights in fucking history, you know? Very uneventful, pardon me. So I guess I can understand fans being annoyed. At the time, maybe betting with their hearts over their brains, thinking Till might be able to land a big shot, but, you know, no rose-tinted glasses over here, dude. When you look at the way Till fights, it's fucking retarded. With all due respect, okay? He was a funny character and all that, but he got roasted, actually, when Daniel Cormier and them were talking about the fight after the fact. They're like, I don't want to see you lead with an uppercut to throw your rear hand unless your name is Conor McGregor in the way that you did, Darren Till, because that's what ended up getting him dropped, was the counter that Tyron Woodley landed. But literally, if you go out throughout Till's entire career after that, it's just a 1-2 that he was able to land on some guys that were not really championship level, except for, I mean, one clean one against Wonderboy. Either way, dude, let's move on to the S tier overrated title contender, and I have a feeling some of you might disagree with me, but it is Brian Ortega. Okay, now the reason he's in S tier, not even the biggest odds in favor of him, but I think we saw him get overrated twice in a row. So let's talk a little bit about it, okay? Now, against Max Holloway, Brian Ortega was a -120 favorite. And then again against Volkanovski was only a +160 underdog, which I understand he's still an underdog, but let's go over why I think this is so fucking insane. Now, he's at S tier because he, like I said, massively overrated contender 2 times in a row against 2 of the best champions that the featherweight division has ever seen. And at the time, I didn't think it made sense that he was a favorite against Max Holloway, and it still doesn't make sense today, you know? I know Frankie Edgar is a legend and all, right? People love Frankie, but listen, he got a title shot off of Frankie Edgar, who was towards the end of his career, at least the best of his career, right? Like, he did get a title shot, I think, after this. Eventually, I think he got a win and then ended up fighting Max Holloway, but his best years were behind him. We have seen him at this point go on a few pretty decently sized losing streaks already, so it's odd. Before that, he beat Cub Swanson and Hanato Moicano, which I understand the Moicano win has aged very well. But at the time, it was kind of just like, whatever. You know, Moicano was not doing his best work at featherweight, which is why he had to fight multiple times after Moicano to get a title shot. This dude never should have been a favorite versus Max Holloway. It was utterly fucking insane. The guy was also, it was funny in the lead up, trying to market himself as the like new young guy, the new breed, not realizing Max Holloway was younger than him, and Max Holloway called him out for it. Like, guys, this guy's younger than me, guys. Guys, I'm only 27, guys. We still getting better, guys. The bless is best, baby. What are you talking about, guys? I'm only 32 right now, guys. This guy's 33. Today, not back then. Either way. Got his face fucking boxed off, okay? Doctor stoppage. Outstruck by 180 significant strikes. He got a defense lesson mid-fight. Max tried to teach him how to block a shot because every single punch Max threw was basically landing at that point in the fight anyways. He looked unrecognizable by the end of it. It was really insane to me at the time. Max Holloway, you know, if you look at his resume, had beat Cub Swanson as well. You know, Charles Oliveira, Jeremy Stevens, Lamas, Pettis, Jose Aldo twice. By the way, I left out 5 of his wins in that streak because these were just the most notable, but a 12-fight win streak, and had just finished Jose Aldo twice. And then you compare that with Brian Ortega, who almost got finished by some guys you would not ever expect to see in a championship fight at all, you know? So, crazy. Now, again, what might be even crazier is that Brian Ortega got overrated again, in my opinion, okay? In a title fight with an even better featherweight, after what we saw in his fight versus fucking crazy. Comes back, gets 1 win over the Korean Zombie. Now, the timeline matters here, okay? This was 2 years after his brutal beating from Max Holloway. And look, he did look good against the Korean Zombie, but in Zombie's last 3 losses, he had been knocked out in those losses. And Ortega going into a fight with a guy who had just beaten Holloway twice at this point, after beating Korean Zombie. The guy who, you're going to fight a guy that beat the guy who butchered your face, and only being a plus 160 underdog. And it was only his 3rd fight in 3 years, going 1-1 in his last 2. One of them being like a beatdown of a lifetime, and having multiple years of like inactivity in between. Fucking crazy. You know, I understand Ortega's jiu-jitsu is dangerous, but it's wild, man, to me, that he had not done anything to earn that 2nd title shot. And we saw him get the shit beaten out of him by a guy that Volk beat twice at this point. Inactive. It's just, you know, the UFC's marketing machine, in my opinion, have always been behind Brian Ortega. He remained high in the rankings despite the inactivity, which this isn't even all of it, right? He's took 2 years off after Holloway, took a year off after Zombie, took a year off after Volk, and 2 years off after the first Yair Rodriguez fight, and somehow remained at the top of featherweight. So should have never been a favorite against Max Holloway, looking at the resumes and looking at the ways Brian Ortega had been hurt in fights and things like that, and whatever else. And also the fact that Max has one of the best chins of all time, so he's not going to flatline him the way that he did Frankie. He's not going to, you know, it's just, and then he, you know, fucking crazy, dude. And when you see him lose to Max Holloway, and then you see Volkanovski beat Max Holloway twice, if you were to book those two, even, I understand MMA math does not always work, okay? And maybe a lot of people underrated Volkanovski's jiu-jitsu and his defense, even though it was pretty clear he trains with Craig Jones. They're both from Australia and all the rest of it, but you know, it's fucking wild. And we saw what, you know, Volkanovski beat the shit out of him. Badly. Brian Ortega's face was almost more mangled against Volkanovski than it was against Max Holloway. So, either way, dude, that's it, bro. See, listen, this video's 41 minutes long and I've not even put in clips yet and shit. So, I have some guys get irritated because I'll miss out a bunch. I'm not necessarily doing it unintentionally because I'm not aware of fights, right? What I'm doing is I'm trying to make the video long, but not too insanely long. And every once in a while, I will do a very long tier list, but For the ones that I want to put out like weekly at the very least, I want them to be a substantial amount of time so that you guys can listen to them while you're working or gaming or doing whatever it is you like to do. But also them not be fucking hours and hours so that I can't get out more than a couple a week, you know? So, either way, dude. Like I said, let me know if you disagree with any, if I've missed any, all the rest of it. Like and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate it. I will see you at the next video. Bye-bye.